Hello everyone. In the lecture today, we are going to talk about the foreign policy of India and its determinants. While talking about the determinants, we are going to move forward and look at how India's foreign policy has evolved through the trials and tribulations of times. So, the two subtopics of Indian foreign policy which we are going to look at would be determinants and evolutions. That is, the factors that determine Indian foreign policy. We will actually start with why at all a country needs a foreign policy, and then we will move towards the evolution aspect of it, and then we will look at one question also. So, let us begin. How to define foreign policy? So, there are multiple definitions. While India trying to conduct its actions while trying to assert its sovereignty, it adopts certain principles, policies, programs and actions, and all of them in totality constitutes India's foreign policy. So, let us look at certain keywords which help us understand foreign policy in relation with other countries, of course. Principles and policies, external relations, totality of actions, objective and activities. Before we move forward, let us look at the philosophy, principle, policy, programs and actions. The most overarching principles can also be conflated with philosophy. So, if you talk about Indian foreign policy, some of the core principles, some of the core philosophy would be peace, non-violence, peace and non-violence, mutual respect, So, based on these principles and philosophies, India has come up with its foreign policy, where these principles form the basic pillars on which the foreign policy of India stands. To implement these policies, we have programs, and programs are not just on paper, they are reflected in actions. For example, look east policy and then act east policy. So, peace, non-violence, mutual respect and then act east. That is one example. We will have a look at it in subsequent lectures, but for now let us look at the next slide. Why does a country need a foreign policy, especially a developing country like India, where we have our own internal problems and own internal issues to deal with? Why do we need to look outside? We need to look outside because the sovereignty has two aspects: internal and external, and both are interrelated. A simple example is India needs to feed its people, secure the life of people. So, we have example of PL 480 program, Public Law 480, where India got grains from USA. So, here USA is an external actor and it is helping us fulfill our internal demand, which is demand for food. So, that is just one example. Another example is S-400 defense systems taken from Russia. We need to secure our borders. And how do we do it? By importing arms and ammunitions, by importing military hardware like S-400 missile system. And to secure the internal interest, we need to exercise our external sovereignty, that is to have relationship with other countries. These are the determinants, the chief determinants of foreign policy of any country. These topics are only indicative, they are not exhaustive. There are too many other factors which determine foreign policy. As we move forward into the lecture, you will understand. But these are the main factors on which the foreign policy of any country depends. We will try to see it all through the help of Indian example. So let's look at them one by one. The size of a state, the size of Indian state. In fact, the part 1 of Indian constitutions deal with the union and its territories, and the size is considered in two ways, in terms of population and in terms of the geographical expanse. India is bigger than USA, and India is also smaller than USA. Bigger in terms of population, more than 4x, 4 times the size, but smaller in geography. X by 3, let's say. India is 1/3 the size of USA, but 4 times when it comes to the population. So in terms of human resources, of course, India is 4x, and in terms of geography, India is 1/3. And it's not just about geography. Geography includes the resource base also. So example of resource base would be Middle East. Some of the Middle Eastern countries are very, very small, but they supply India with essential crude oil, because the Indian production of crude oil is very, very meager, and India, more than 3/4 of the Indian requirement of crude oil is imported, and Middle East has been one of the important sources despite being very, very small. So size matters, but not always. Resource endowment also matters. High resource base does not always mean prosperity, because there is something called resource curse also. Resource curse. Diamonds are precious, but some of the diamond producing countries, diamond exporting countries are very poor. Coal is called black diamond. Jharkhand is the coal capital of India. In fact, Sindri inside Jharkhand has been called the coal capital of India. Jharkhand has not been able to make itself a rich state with the help of that black diamond. So one example is African example, diamond, and then black diamond, which is the another name for coal. Resource matters, but the efficient utilization of resources are of prime importance. For example, Japan is not resource rich, Israel is not resource rich. Japan, Israel both have resource crunch, and they have a smaller sizes, but they have been able to use the limited resources to their advantage. Japan has been importing raw material and then exporting the finished high-tech goods. So size matters, but not always. Innovation matters a lot. In case of Japan and Israel, it's innovation and a will. innovation. Innovation strategy. We can change our friends, but we cannot change our neighbors. This has been said with respect to India's relation with Pakistan. So, geography is the most permanent and stable factor. Most permanent. For example, India exports basmati rice to the Middle Eastern countries, basmati rice, because India has got a good monsoon system. Monsoon is actually called the real finance minister of India, the real finance minister. Real finance minister. It helps us on important forex reserves. So this goes to Middle Eastern countries, Middle East, and what we get from Middle East is crude oil. Crude. So this is how India's relationship with, for example, Middle East is determined by the fertility, climate, land, topography. For rare earth minerals, India has relationship with Central Asian countries, Central Asia, and India has come up with Connect Central Asia policy. Connect Central Asia. Central Asia. This rests on international north-south transport corridor. This is all part of India's foreign policy based on geography. Historical factors. India, Pakistan. In fact, we will look at historical factors in some more detail little later in our lecture. Anti-imperialist and anti-colonial stand of foreign policy of new sovereign states, including India. These new sovereign states were mostly in Asia and Africa, who were governed by the European powers. European powers. They were newly independent nations, and India formed an alliance, and India led the non-aligned movement. We'll talk about that non-aligned movement little later. So historical factors are also important. So we are going to look at some of the historical factors in little more detail. What is national interest? National interest can be called the most important factor in determining foreign policy. What exactly is national interest? You can flip the words in the phrase, what is in the interest of the nation is national interest. Whatever is in the interest of India is India's national interest. So, safe and secure borders, safe plus secure borders is in the interest of India, and not just border, but inside the border, lives of people, security of life of the people, and not just security of life, but the quality of life. Quality of life which is reflected in growth and prosperity. Growth and prosperity of the nation. Growth and prosperity. So security, growth, prosperity. Security, growth and prosperity. These can be called national interest. Are national interests constant or they are in flux? Answer is they are constant, and they are also constantly changing. Depending on the specific time period, the national interest has certain constant and certain variables. For example, at some point of time, we had grain deficit of grains, food deficit. So India needed to have a good relation with USA to get grains under PL 480 program. But the Green Revolution was largely successful. India is food surplus country now. India is able to supply food, supply grains in fact. So the situations have changed. So this is in flux. However, let's say balance of payment, or there is another meaning of balance of payment, sorry, BOP, which is balance of power. So we look at balance of payment as well as balance of power. Balance of payment means you have surplus, and deficit would mean that you owe to the world more than the world owes you. However, with respect to national interest, this is balance of power. Balance of power. Let's talk about power first. Power is important in the sense that at the national level, NATIONAL, and then we have international level, international and national. Here we have order, some kind of order. For example, there is a state and there is a law making body, law enforcing body and law adjudicating body, order, and some kind of system, justice. But at the international level, there is largely disorder. We do have law making bodies at the international levels, but the enforcement mechanism is lacking. So the enforcement mechanism is lacking. So the law making, international law has been called soft laws because the enforcement has been lacking. That causes disorder. And in place of justice, the most important factors become power. The most important factor becomes power. Power is a relative concept. If your enemy is able to muster enough or sufficient or matching power with you, then you do not have any specific advantage. So in case your power depletes over a period of time and your adversary power depletes much more, you are still in an advantageous position, and hence power has been called a relative concept. So balance of power. At national level, order, international disorder. National level, justice is the main ideal. Power becomes the realistic ideal. The realist school of thought. We'll talk about the realist school of thought also in determinant of foreign policy. Okay. So balance of power. Sometimes it has also been called the balance of terror. Terror. Any kind of terror. Nuclear terror. Nukes. So to secure national interest, a country might accumulate weapons, conventional and unconventional. Deterrence, for example, nuclear deterrence. What is nuclear deterrence? Nuclear deterrence is, sometimes it is argued that nuclear weapons lead to peace. Why? Because countries know that use of nuclear weapons might lead to mutually assured destruction. Mad. So countries do not escalate the war. This is called nuclear deterrence. India's Nuclear policy talks about nuclear deterrence, credible minimum deterrence. Intelligence, raw and IB, CIA, propaganda, role of international media, state sponsored media, ideology. We will talk about ideology, especially the Cold War ideology. Cold War ideology, where the world was divided into two ideological factions, the capitalists and the communists. Capitalists led by USA and the communists led by USSR. Economic and social development, of course, prosperity. China's economic development is linked to the quantum of export. China has been called factory of the world. Factory of the world. Factory of the world. Balance of payment, surplus, positive balance of payment. But because of COVID, this export took a hit, and now China is focusing on its domestic consumption. This is not the case with India. The situation is reverse. Indian economy is on the path of prosperity, not just because of export. It's consumption led development, and export is one small part of it. All right. So this is a bit about national interest. Ideological factors. Yes, when the world was divided into two factions led by two ideological powerhouses, the USA and the USSR, and India's foreign policy was tinged with non-alignment to either of these factions. These were largely called socialist blocks or the Eastern Bloc, underlined by Warsaw Pact, USA leading NATO, the capitalist or the Western Bloc, Western Bloc, Western Bloc. India chose not to join either of them, and India tried to secure its sovereignty, newfound independence, secure prosperity, fight poverty. So India became the de facto non-aligned movement leader of the third world, first world, second world, and the third world, mostly comprising of the newly independent nation of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So yes, the Cold War politics ended with disintegration of USSR. We can name a year, which is 1990. National will. National will is one of the most important inputs of foreign policy. Culture, education system, is it rooted in its own culture? Is it rooted in its own culture, or it has given way to westernization or Americanization, or it has tried to align itself with some or the other regional groupings or power blocks. Anti-colonial policies which evolved during India's struggle for independence, and anti-apartheid policies, the policy which made color the basis of power and privileges in South Africa. So from the very early days, Mahatma Gandhi is one example who went to South Africa and fought war against the colored skin people, especially the African and the Asians, against the British colonial power. So national will is very important. When the government changes, the national will changes. Sometimes the opposite also happens. The change in national will or the public opinion leads to change in the government also. Next determinant of foreign policy is social and government structure. A society which is united, enlightened, disciplined has a high degree of unity and integrity. Unity and integrity is preserved. Example, Germany and Japan, despite losing in World War II, they progressed. Lost World War II, but still progressed. Why? Because it fulfilled this condition. Germany and Japan fulfill this condition. Internal conflicts, example, Pakistan, short-lived experiment with democracy, short-lived, or intermittent experiments with democracy. Experiments with democracy. Making Pakistan a de facto military state, a de facto, that is in fact, in reality, de facto military state. That is, even the democratically or the so-called democratically elected government is being maneuvered by the military itself. So it's a de facto military country or de facto military state. All right. In charge are democratically elected. Yes. Another example is the military junta of Myanmar. Similar is the situation in Myanmar also. Myanmar also has on and off relationship with democracy. So the military junta was ruling, then a democracy was imposed, which did not last more than a decade, and now we have again the military junta rule. So junta is military rule in Myanmar. Democratization of policy making process. This has been led by technology and media. Technological advancement, media, open society, openness, or sometimes also because fall of USSR, rise of the liberal world order. So liberal democracies have been called to win the war of ideology against socialism. So even the foreign policy making is democratized, much more institutions are involved, much more stakeholders are involved. In some or the other lecture, we will also do the institutions which make foreign policy. Religion. This reminds us of clash of civilization. Clash of civilization. After the end of history. End of history is an ideological positioning done by Francis Fukuyama or the American scholars also. After the fall of USSR, fall of socialism, what we have is, after this we have come to this clash of civilization, where largely 9/11 has proved that the Islamic world is in constant conflict with the Christian world. Islamic world in constant conflict with Christian world. 9/11 has proved it. Afghanistan in past 20 years is one great example of role of religion in foreign policy. Even historically, this war has been there. This is about late 1980s. This is about 1990s. Despite the perpetual tension prevailing with Pakistan, the government of India undertakes and supports an annual pilgrimage. Nankana Sahib, yes. Yes. This is informally called Nankana Sahib. So, role of religion is in diplomacy. Of course, this is also called track 1.5 diplomacy. Track 1.5 diplomacy. Track 1.5. What is track 1.5 diplomacy? So let me explain you. There is something called multi-track diplomacy. Multi-track diplomacy, where the two important tracks are track 1 and track 2. Track 1 and then we have track 2. Track 1 is led by the state, led by the government, led by the formal institutions. Track 2 is led by the businessmen, cultural organizations, people to people contact. That is track 2. A combination of these two is called track 1.5. So people are undergoing pilgrimage with the help of or with the support of the state. This is track 1.5 diplomacy. That is the mean between track 1 and track 2. That is the state and the non-state actors. Both are involved. However, non-state actors has some other meaning also, which is largely associated with some of the NGOs and some of the terrorist organizations also. Foreign policy, for example, domestic policy is influenced by the domestic environment, the domestic situation. The foreign policy or the external policy is underlined by the external environment. So when the external environment change, foreign policy change. Example, India was largely called a semi-satellite. India was a semi-satellite of not fully a satellite, but semi-satellite of USSR. But after fall of USSR, things changed. India started looking westwards. India got loan from IMF and World Bank during the precarious situation, and India embarked on liberalization, privatization and globalization. Sometimes it's also called economic freedom. economic independence, sometimes economic independence, which is called after 1991, which is started here. So because of change in external environment, let me give you another example. Energy crisis, CATSA, countering America's adversary through Trade Sanction Act. Crude oil is very, very important. Crude oil is very, very important for India. Iran was one of the most important supplier of crude oil at reasonable rates. But India had to stop taking crude oil from Iran on a 15-day notice, or let's say 15-day warning from the USA, as per this CATSA. So when external environment changes, India has to adopt to the changing environment. But recently India got waiver from CATSA when India, despite all the pressures, India did not compromise on its sovereignty and its security, and India went ahead, despite warning, went ahead with S-400 defense systems from Russia. So one of the diaspora, that is a person from Indian origin, moved a motion in the American Congress to give a waiver, a sanction waiver to India, so that India can go ahead with S-400 deal with Russia. That's one of the important roles which has been played by Indian diaspora. Diaspora is an important part of the syllabus. It has been specifically mentioned, and Mr. Sunak is again part of diaspora. The Vice President of USA is part of diaspora. All right. So moving forward, let's look at climate justice in some detail. Climate change. We have properly entered Anthropocene. Anthropocene is the era where the anthropogenic sources, anthropogenic changes have taken precedence over natural changes, are at all-time high. It is said to originate since industrial revolution in 18th century. Industrial revolution. Anthropogenic changes, and this has taken a front seat in the past 40 to 50 years. In the 1970s, this has started taking precedence over so many other factors. Developmental disparities, these are the key words. We'll talk about it. Common but differentiated responsibilities, climate justice, global commons, rising sea level, high seas, especially the deep seas. High seas are deep sea. This reminds me of Gandhi, M.K. Gandhi, the father of the nation. Around 100 years back, this guy, M.K. Gandhi, said that if rest of the world starts growing like the Western world, we will need 7 earths. 7 earths. Because the Western world is materialistic and consumption driven. Western civilization. Gandhi said that Western civilization is materialistic, consumption driven, consumption driven. He used a very strong phrase for Western civilization. He called it satanic. And he said that if the rest of the world starts aping the Western civilization, we will need 7 Earths. This was not in vogue. Climate change, climate justice was not in vogue at that point of time, 100 years back. But Gandhi could foresee it. Common but differentiated responsibility would mean the developing countries of Africa and Asia need to develop further. The conditions and the development levels reached in Africa is still very, very low. So the per capita consumption, let's look at it in per capita consumption of energy in USA plus Europe is very, very high, very, very high. But the population in Asia and Africa is very high. Asia plus Africa, high population. If this high population starts consuming the same on per capita level, then we will destroy Earth. Will destroy Earth. Because we cannot choose to grow like USA and Europe. We will need almost unlimited, impossible level of conventional energy. All the coal, all the crude will be exhausted if the per capita consumption of these resources in Asia and Africa start matching the per capita consumption level of USA or Europe. So what do we need to do? We need to look at a different system. We need to move to the renewables. Meanwhile, growth is important. Indira Gandhi has said that poverty is the biggest polluter. Indira Gandhi has said poverty is the biggest polluter. Is the biggest pollution or polluter. That's what Indira Gandhi has said. So we need to balance our resources and the judicious use of resources with our developmental priorities. So balancing. So we need common but differentiated responsibilities when it comes to reduction in carbon consumption, low carbon consumption. We need to balance the Asian and African growth also. So we'll keep on consuming. India will keep on consuming coal for the next few decades before it phases out coal and it switches to unconventional and the renewable sources of energy. So this bargaining has to happen on the international negotiation table, at WTO, at UNCCD. So for this purpose, developing countries come together. For this purpose, developing countries bargain together. Developing countries come together to bargain. Join together. Join together to bargain with developed countries. At UNCCD and at WTO. And this underpins the solidarity of the developing countries. This would ensure equity. This would ensure equity and balancing growth and taking care of triple bottom line. Triple bottom line. What is triple bottom line? The liberal democratic system or the capitalistic system has been focusing only on the profit. Now we need to focus on not just profit but people and planet while making profit. We cannot be destroying planet for profit or for people. So people for planet, planet for people. Global commons, high seas would be global common. We need to protect our high seas, the sea pollution or the microplastics reaching the seas. Historical responsibility of high consumption, of high per capita consumption, high per capita consumption of resources. So developing countries cannot be barred. So for this negotiation, climate change becomes one of the important topics, one of the important determinants of foreign policy. So we are going to look at now at the phases of India's foreign policy. So as we look at the phases of India's foreign policy, these six have been enumerated by the diplomat turned, should we say politician? Okay, he was the Foreign Secretary of India and now he is the Minister of External Affairs. So this has been enumerated by the current Minister of External Affairs. So this person is not just an analyst. This person is a practitioner of foreign policy at the highest level, practitioner, and then he is a scholar. He fits the bill of a philosopher king, the Platonic philosopher king. Our current Minister of External Affairs fits the bill of philosopher king. He is wise and he is dunning the office of a minister. He fits the bill. But before that, in the pre-independence era, we had phase 1 and phase 2. The second phase, this was determined by the colonial masters, and this was before that, largely Mughals and Delhi Sultanate. Delhi. So phase 1, phase 2. Let's look at these phases and then we'll come at the current classification of independent India's foreign policy. Pre-British history, Mughal period. In fact, Jahangir, you remember Jahangir received Hawkins in his court, and there was a series of people who came to India during Mughal time, even in the Vijayanagar Empire from whole of Europe. Domingo Paez, Nunez and others. India functions as the bridge between the Middle East and East Asia, of course. Even geographically, this is Sri Lanka, this is Middle East, and this is East Asia. Sri Lanka, India, Middle East, Asia. Geographically also, geographically as well as, look at this, goods and ideas. Strategic location, of course, economic powerhouse for centuries, till the colonial masters ruined Indian economy, till colonial masters ruined it. Going back to the ancient times, Bay of Bengal was called the Chola Lake because the power of Rajendra Chola went till Southeast Asia. Now, the period of subjugation. The period of subjugation, here the Indian economy was subjugated to the global economy which was run by the British Empire. British Empire. Indian tea, Indian opium, it was all for colonial masters to trade with. And poverty and the un-British rule. Was a book written by one of the Indian scholars, politician, and statesman, Sir Dadabhai Naoroji, which is about this time. So, during, for example, the policy of ring fence, was to protect the crown in the jewel. That is, the Indian Empire was to be protected against the Russian Tsarist interventions. So, Afghanistan was used as a buffer. Nepal was used as a buffer. So, it was not saving India for India's sake. It was saving India for the sake of the empire. And that is the actual definition of a master-servant relation and a relationship of subjugation. However, Belgium, the cockpit of Europe, the empire-shaking battles have been fought in Panipat, and that has been the case in Belgium also, the cockpit of Europe. It has been called the cockpit for the same reason. But anyway, so the future Prime Minister of Congress of Oppressed Nationality, this finally took shape actually. Gandhi inspired many people all over the world. He continues to inspire. So, the core tenets of Indian foreign policy are rooted in Indian culture and Indian national movement. The core tenets of Indian foreign policy are rooted in Indian culture and, as I said, Indian national movement. All right. So, let's look at what the Philosopher King has to say. The ex-Foreign Secretary, as I said, ex-Foreign Secretary of India. Era of optimistic non-alignment. It was possible. Front foot. Of course, 1928 Belgium. Asian Relations Conference. Global South, the de facto leader of Global South, the de facto leader of Global South, de facto leader at that point of time was India. Of course, the formalization of non-aligned movement, and as I said that non-alignment was not exactly as, and I am saying this because non-alignment is sometimes misunderstood, it was not non-interventionist, it was quite a strategic in nature. It was not a policy of isolation. Non-alignment was not isolation, isolationist policy, it was not, definitely not. So, research USSR, some of the nuclear power plants, some of the nuclear and steel power plant were established with the help of USSR. Some of the biggest dams were established with the help of USSR. And the agriculture needs were Public Law 480, the food aid program of USAID. So basically, India is taking help from both issue based, and because of that, India has been called a clever calf drinking milk from two cows. The two cows are, these are the two cows, cow 1 and cow 2. So, non-aligned movement for this strategic reason holds a great deal of significance even today, even though the meetings are not very regular. but India has been leading the process, and non-aligned movement remains very, very relevant even today. The relevance of NAM cannot be questioned on a strategic basis. Optimistic non-alignment has been called idealism in foreign policy by Shashi Tharoor, who was the Minister of External Affairs for quite some time in the Congress government, ex-MEA. He also was Under Secretary General in the United Nations. This was the time when Panchashil was founded. Panch means 5, Shil means pillars. So 5 pillars of Sino-India relations. Sino-India relation, 5 pillars of Sino-India relations. What are these 5 pillars? Mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in domestic affairs, equality and mutual benefit, peaceful coexistence. The idea of Panchashil was adopted by many nations, and Panchashil as a doctrine has been one of the most important contribution of India's foreign policy to other countries' foreign policy. However, this could not work out well, and India was jolted out of this kind of idealism when the Dalai Lama came to India, and within few years China launched a full-fledged attack on the eastern and the northern border of India. India lost territories. So, peaceful cooperation instead of balance of terror, no balance of terror, it's part of balance of power. India and China were unequal powers in 1962, and they are unequal in 2022. Unequal in what sense? Unequal militarily and unequal economically. It can be argued that India was maybe in a slightly better condition in 1962 than in 2022, and India is going to catch up in future, and India is going to exceed militarily and economically. That is just the projection. All right. So, balance of terror is to be replaced with peaceful cooperation. So, balance of terror was the key idea during the Cold War era. Cold War era. And this balance of terror was actually nuclear balancing, which precipitated into Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis. You can read about Cuban Missile Crisis, or we can take it up in one of the classes as a short lecture, or you can just watch a short video on Cuban Missile Crisis and just keep a short note on it. So, when India was given a wake-up call with a warring jolt by China, wake up to the truth of China, illusion of Hindi Chini bhai bhai, illusion based on Panchashil. So, this era of idealism was over. Idealism is over. We are done with that. And not only this, Pakistan gathered the guts to attack India in 1965 with the help of China. This is the condition even in 2022. As of today, this is the condition. Pakistan is able to say and do things with the help of China. China-Pakistan economic corridor is passing through Pak occupied territory of India, that is Gilgit-Baltistan. So this one is an era of realism. This is ending with division of Pakistan, Pak Banga division. That happens little later. All right. This was called sometimes the dangerous decades also, dangerous decades. 3 prime ministers in 8 years. Lal Bahadur Shastri was killed outside India, Tashkent. It is also said that before Lal Bahadur Shastri, Nehru could not take a hit to his stature when he lost the war in 1962 and he passed away in 1964. Under the leadership of Lal Bahadur Shastri, the war was fought in 1965. He gave Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan slogan. He was also braving the food crisis, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, to which Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee added Jai Vigyan. Jai Vigyan. This was added in the 1990s. Shyam Saran is again has been India's foreign secretary, and he talks about in his book how India sees the world. He talks about the Middle Kingdom complex. India will never suffer a Middle Kingdom complex. So let's talk about what is Middle Kingdom complex. Shyam Saran says in his book that China's conception of itself, or Chinese ideas and the ideas of itself, is inherently hierarchical. That is, they see themselves as part of an advanced Han core, ancient. This might remind you of ancient Silk Route. Advanced civilization, advanced Han core, above less civilized nations. This is how China sees itself. It sees itself as much more advanced than others, and it sees itself as the center of the world. That is Chinese cosmology, how China sees itself. But how India sees itself, or how India sees the world? He gives an example of cosmology of the Mahabharata, which locates India as the southern branch of a 4-petaled lotus. That is, India is part of the larger structure. India is not whole, India is not soul. And this also reminds of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that whole world is a family. So India will never suffer from the Middle Kingdom complex with which China suffers, especially because the Indian conception, the Indian mythology, Indian cosmology sees itself as part of a bigger whole. Creation of Bangladesh during Indira Gandhi. There is a popular lore that Indira Gandhi was called Devi Durga by the eloquent Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who later became the Prime Minister of India. regional power within the South Asia. India is definitely a regional power. Is India a world power? Answer is no. Is India a balancing power? Answer is yes. So we'll look at the position of India as a balancing power or as a great balancer. So we'll look at that. But before that, era of regional assertion within South Asia. Bangladesh was created out of East Pakistan. Regional influence in the Tamil civil war in Sri Lanka against the LTTE. Yes, regional assertion. PM Rajiv Gandhi went and met PM Benazir Bhutto. Relations were temporarily better. Quest for a strategic autonomy. Why? It was a new world, fundamentally different from the Cold War politics. The semi-satellite, which India has been called, the semi-satellite of USSR. USSR was the guiding force of India from the 1960s, and USSR collapsed. So after the collapse of USSR, collapse of communism, what do? You go ahead with the hegemon. Sometimes going with the hegemon is also called bandwagoning. BAND, band, WA, wagon. Bandwagon. So going with the hegemon is called bandwagoning. Now, there are other alternates available, which is balancing. Balancing could be internal balancing or it could be external balancing. So we are able to balance with the help of your internal power, with your own economic and military might. You are able to balance. Economic and military might, you are able to balance. If you are not able to gather so much of economic and military might, then what do? You take help of the external actors. You take help of other countries, and that's called external balancing. India chose to improve relationship with USA, the West in general. India, that's what India chose to improve relations. US allies, of course. US allies, South Asia, ASEAN and Israel. India launched Look East policy. Look East policy at this time. Strategic autonomy is also important. That can be done by balancing. Strategic balancing, STRATEGIC, strategic balancing. Despite massive international pressure, the government headed by Atal Bihari Vajpayee conducted nuclear test. One nuclear test was also conducted by Indira Gandhi. Pokhran 1, this was Pokhran 2. Two nuclear bombs were exploded. Australia, Japan and US sanctioned India. This was tough time, very tough time. Very tough time. Australia, Japan, US are good friends of India now, especially Australia and Japan. We cannot be sure of USA. Sometimes it's called that an enemy like USA or a friend like USA is always a problem. So USA can neither be a good friend nor a good enemy. One always has to be wary of USA. India neither signed non-proliferation treaty nor did it sign CTBT. Non-proliferation of nuclear weapon, comprehensive test ban treaty. India did not sign either of them. India is not in favor of nuclear proliferation. India is in favor of nuclear disarmament, but this disarmament has to be fair and equitable. It cannot be undemocratic. The P5, the permanent 5 of the United Nations Security Council cannot be monopolizing the nuclear power and asking India to shun or give away its nuclear weapons. We can learn a lesson from Ukraine. Ukraine was having one of the largest, if not the largest. It has substantial nuclear weapons in the 90s, but it destroyed them under certain conditions. As of today, Russia would definitely not have attacked Ukraine had it be having nuclear weapons. So nuclear deterrence works. This is one great example, and Ukraine had destroyed and surrendered its nukes in the early 90s, and Ukraine is now facing a war or almost annihilation. So yes, however, over a period of time we will see that India, after 1999, after this sanction, India got multiple waivers. India is not a member of nuclear supplier group. But India is treated like a member of nuclear supplier group because India is a responsible nuclear power. What is the example of irresponsible nuclear power? Pakistan has been called a mad child with bloody knife. Pakistan has been called a mad child with bloody knife because it has nuclear weapons, which has arguably been on sale by AQ Khan, which has been sold to North Korea. Responsible nuclear power, and Pakistan is a mad child with a bloody knife. Bloody knife is the nuclear weapon. All right. This responsibility is also shown by the fact that India says that we are not going to use nuclear weapon first. NFU, no first use policy. We'll talk about that in a different lecture, the nuclear policy of India. So India-Russia special and privileged relationship truly signals the beginning of a strategic partnership with the USA, and till now India has signed all the foundational agreement of cooperation, basic exchange and cooperation agreement, COMCASA, LIMOA. So India is not a member of NATO, but India is treated at par with NATO. India is not a member of NATO, but treated on par, because the foundational agreements of military and security cooperation have been signed. There is one more, SISMOA. So these have been signed over a period of time. This tells that India has really been a balancing power. Minefields of international politics, yes. Deftly coping with superpowers, yes. We can see this in the global affairs, yes. So India has been sometimes called a middle power. India is not a great power. India is a middle power. What is the meaning of middle power? That India alone cannot wage a very big war or a very big conflict, or India alone cannot cause a tectonic shift in the global affairs, but with one or more superpowers or other middle powers, India can make a significant change. That is one example of middle power. Another example of middle power is Australia, Canada, Japan. Middle powers. So middle powers, when they cooperate with the superpowers or within themselves, they can do a lot, and with that they can secure their national interests in conjugation with other powers. GCC states, Iran and Israel. Fine strategic balancing has been the key. Fine strategic balancing. Strategic balancing. This is continuing even today. The current foreign policy is marked by fine strategic balancing even during the Ukraine crisis. India's limited comment, India's silent support to Russia has been example of fine strategic balancing, going ahead with cooperation with USA at the same time with Russia. This has been called energetic diplomacy by our current Minister of External Affairs. Assertive. There are domestic reasons. And reasons which are not domestic or external reasons. Domestic reasons, India is a strong government. India has a majority government. So majority government in the sense that the last majority government was in 1984, and then after that the majority government arrived in 2014. So this is a domestic reason. External reasons could be the growth rate which India has, and the reforms and the engagement which has started, the liberalization, privatization and globalization. So India's presence at external forums have been important. So Atmanirbhar and globalization go hand in hand. This makes India, example of this is Make in India. The defense hardware will be made in India. Defense hardware. Sensitive components like chips, computer chips will be made in India. Globalization is standing up to bullies in the region. Of course, India is standing up to the bullies in the region. Doklam. And recent Leh. Global powers on the verge of ascendancy. Global powers. USSR, USA. There are neither permanent friends nor foes, but only national interests that are permanent. And the nature of national interest may keep on changing, may keep on evolving. Any kind of solid foundation in Indian foreign policy is incomplete without knowing Kautilya and his work. So let's talk about the life and the times of Kautilya and his work. So Kautilya is also known as Acharya Vishnugupta. So Acharya means a teacher. Where exactly was he teaching? He was a professor of political science at Takshila University. He also had connections with the university at Nalanda. The name of his book was Arthashastra. This is among the finest. This is among the finest of the books on statecraft. statecraft till today, and this is a seminal work which gave rise to other commentaries on statecraft. Kautilya is also called Indian Machiavelli. Indian Machiavelli. That's what the Western scholars address him as. Even though Machiavelli existed in 16th century AD and almost 1800 years back in the 3rd century BC, Kautilya was active. Machiavelli wrote a book named The Prince. The Prince. Machiavelli is also called the father of realist school of thought. The father of realist school in foreign policy. In foreign policy or international relation. Father of realist school. Kautilya was able to get his king. The name of his king was Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta Maurya. Sometimes it is also said that Mauryan Empire was the first real big empire in India, the first empire. So in this way, Kautilya was the first empire builder. First empire builder. Kautilya got his king, and a great one at that. It is said that Machiavelli never got his prince. So ideally, because of the time difference, because of chronology, Machiavelli should be called European Kautilya, but that is how it is. Kautilya on statecraft mentions some of the key tenets. For example, power, as I said, power is the key idea or the key force which runs foreign policy or international relations. Power. Power is the possession of a strength, and it is in 3 forms. Mantra Shakti, power of knowledge, that is power of counsel. From this we have a term called mantri, or a counselor who gives counsel or advisor. And the process of giving the advice has been called mantrana. The aid and advice given to the chief executive, that is the king, that process is known as mantrana. So power of knowledge, knowledge is power, power of counsel. Prabhu Shakti, power of might. What kind of might? Military power and economic power. Army is military, treasury is economy. Military power and economic power. Utshah Shakti, power of energy. As we say, energetic diplomacy. The 6th phase, as we saw, as energetic diplomacy, power of valor. So this is how Kautilya defines power. This is the power-centric view. This is the realist view. Kautilya was more Machiavellian than Machiavelli himself. Let's see how. In his mandala theory, he says that natural neighbors are most likely to be natural enemies. And king on the Rajyabhishek must start expansion, starting from the neighbors. So, enemy of enemy is your friend. That's the basic idea here. Enemy of your enemy is your friend. Make friends with the enemy of your enemy. His foreign policy is marked by the 6 measures. That is the Shadgun. Shadgun measures, Shad is 6. The 6 measures or the 6 qualities. Sandhi. Sandhi is peace treaty. peace treaty. When you are weak, make peace. That's what he's saying. Vigrah. Vigrah is fight when you are stronger. Fight when you are stronger. Make peace when you are weak. Fight when you are stronger. This fight could be offensive or defensive. Defensive realism and offensive realism, as we say in current parlance. Morgenthau is often quoted even during Ukraine-Russia crisis. Offensive realism. Kautilya believed in offensive realism. He believed in offensive realism much more. The current policy of National Security Advisor of India today can be called offensive defense. Offensive defense. Offensive defense. Strike when you are stronger. Start the war. Peace when you are weak. War when you are strong. Asan, that is the Sanskrit or the Hindi term. While writing it in Roman script, this becomes asana. Asan is to sit, to do nothing, to remain passive, remain quiet, not planning to march. Marching on the enemy is not to be done. Wait so that the enemy gets weaker. This is sometimes also known as bait and bleed. Bait and bleed. Bait and bleed. This is what USA is trying to do with Russia. This is what USA is trying to do with Russia today. USA is trying to engage one of the powers, that is Russia, in a war with Ukraine, and USA is supplying ammunitions to Ukraine so that Russia keeps on bleeding. Even when Russia wins, it turns into a Pyrrhic victory. That is a victory with a lot of damages. So a victory which is almost like a defeat. So that is what USA is ensuring, baiting and bleeding, giving arms and ammunition to Ukraine so that even if Russia wins, Russia emerges out of the war in a much weaker stage. So that is asana. This is yan. You might have heard of Heenyan, Mahayan. Yan is basically a vehicle. This has turned into yana in Roman. So this is vehicle and then marching on the expedition. So the march. Surely strong than his enemy. Surely strong then march. So this is very close to Vigrah. Vigrah is to fight, hostility. Complete dominant then march. So Vigrah is you are powerful. When you are completely powerful, completely dominant, then march. Start the march. Sanshray, seeking ashray, seeking shelter. Ashray is the Sanskrit term, that is seeking shelter, so that you gather your courage and wits and then relaunch the attack. We see that in the moral science books or the history books of kids of class 5, class 6, that Maharana Pratap lost the battle and he retreated to the jungles, and then he gathered his strength and courage and relaunched the attack. So this has also been done during guerrilla warfare tactics. One is protected and assured, thereby it is also implied that the king would be making continuous effort to recoup his strength, gather men and material to relaunch the attack. Dvad bhavo, dvad is double. Dvad means dual. Bhav is policy. So make peace with one and make war with another one. While making peace and sandhi, you take military and financial help. That's what India did in 1971. India took support from USSR and India created Bangladesh in the war. So while waging the war with Pakistan, India made peace with, India signed a friendship deal with USSR. This policy is referred for the king who is equally strong to enemy and he cannot win the battle without additional strength. So, because Pakistan was supported by USA at that point of time. Saptang theory of the state. Sapt means 7. Ang means limbs. 7 limbs of the state. The sovereign is at the core. He is the core and the crux. Amatya is the minister. The terms are also very, very important for the exam. They can be asked in prelims, mains, anywhere, even in the interview. They have been asked multiple times in the prelims exam. Amatya. The term Amatya or Mantrin are used synonymously. Not only advise the king whenever their advice was sought, maintain the secrecy. Indian constitution as of today says the aid and advice given by the council of ministers to the prime minister or to the president has to be secret. They take the oath of secrecy when they take the oath of office. Together with the oath of office, they take the oath of secrecy even today. Janpad. Jan is people or Jana is people. Pad is foot, where the place where people set their foot, or it can be called a town or a village. All right. This is unique because this is the basis for the growth, prosperity, protection of Janpad. We have the state, we have the king. Accommodate and support the people, defend the state against the enemy, national interest, find occupation of people, employability, have manageable neighbors, of course, provide pastures, agriculture, economy. So, occupation, this is about economy, occupation and pastures. So, taxation will also be benefited. The kosha, we will talk about the kosha. Kosh is the treasury, have arable lands, mines, forest, source for tax, source of tax, which is going to enrich the kosh. Kosha. Provide good internal communication. For this, Ministry of Road Transport and Highway, outlet to the sea. Yes. Fortification, securing the borders. Today, securing the border, internal security, border security and internal security. Today, it can be called border security and internal security. Internal security. Both offensive and defensive purposes, the fort has to be used. The treasury, the flourishing and fledgling economy is required for a sound treasury. So, these are the taxes, sources of taxes. Dand is force, power. Kshatriya army, which has to be hereditary. Defensive, offensive. Even though Kautilya favored this one over this defensive, but depending on the situation, defensive tactics could also be applied. According to Kautilya, the political isolation means death. India tried to politically isolate Pakistan. India tried to politically isolate Pakistan by not engaging with Pakistan over SAARC meetings and at other international forums. So, in place of SAARC, India tried to give a fillip to BIMSTEC, Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, of which Pakistan is not a part. Friends are of two types, natural allies. Israel has been called a natural ally of India. Israel has been called a natural ally of India at times. whose friendship is derived from the times the king's father and grandfather. So as per this definition, USSR fits the bill. USSR or Russia, let's say Russia today fits the bill, because India sought inspiration even in 1917 revolution, the Russian revolution, Red Revolution. The Kritrim or the acquired ally, you can call it artificial also, especially resorted to during certain times. Traditional permanent ally is much more important than an acquired ally. So, moving forward, we are going to have a look at these related topics in subsequent lectures, but not today. These are some of the foundational ideas when we talk of India's foreign policy. I am leaving you with a question, which is, with respect to foreign policy, it is sometimes said that India lacks a strategic culture. Do you agree? Substantiate your arguments. So I can give you certain hints also. We have talked about Kautilya right now. So of course we have Kautilya. I am giving you certain hints on the basis of which you can write your answer. We have Kautilya. More Machiavellian than Machiavelli himself. More Machiavellian than Machiavelli himself. We can say he built the first Indian empire with the help of Chandragupta Maurya, who was of unknown origin and laid the foundation of the first real empire builder, first real empire, during a time when Alexander the Great, invaded the Indian borders. India was divided into multiple principalities, smaller sovereign kings who were infighting among themselves. So he unified them all, unity of India, unity and integrity, and laid the foundation of the empire. His grandson, Chandragupta Maurya grandson, early kingship and later kingship, when he followed the Kautilyan policy in the early kingship, he was able to expand the empire. He called himself Piyadasi Devam Priya, far and wide. We have his edicts. But when he later followed the non-Kautilyan Buddhist philosophy, his empire declined. Ashokan empire declined. King Ashoka later, non-Kautilyan policy of peace, non-Kautilyan, he went into a decline. The Mauryan empire went into decline. But before and after Kautilya, can we look at certain examples? So we do have certain examples even before Kautilya. So we can probably come up with the answer by talking about the past and the present. Past in ancient India, medieval, modern, and then recent decades. In ancient we have Kautilyan example, but even before Kautilya, in the Dharma Shastra tradition, Dharma Shastras, do we have some kind of informed positioning on foreign policy? So answer is yes. The foundation of the Dharma Shastra is the Vedas. Even in Vedas, we have Purandar. Purandar has been used for Lord Indra, the fort destroyer. The fort destroyer. So we have been worshipping gods. We also have various kind of yagna. For example, Ashwamedh. Ashwamedh. Ashwamedh has been mentioned in Ramayana as well as Mahabharata. This is quite strategic. We are allowing the horse of the sovereign to run the distance beyond the borders, around the borders. If somebody is stopping the horse and the chariot, the person has to wage war and sustain the war. So this is very, very strategic, Ashwamedh. We can see multiple examples in the Indian mythological historical traditions, apart from Kautilya also. We see the golden phase of Indian history as the Gupta era, but the Kautilyan policy was not followed after the Gupta era. The integrity of the nation was, in fact, the idea of India was being destroyed, and India disintegrated into again multiple kingships, multiple sovereignties, and that lands India into dark ages and invasions again, the same kind of invasion which Kautilya talks about. So dark ages, invasions, series of invasions. Some of the invaders did not go back after loot and plunderings. They integrated themselves into the Indian culture. Chief among them is the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals. So the Mughals also came up with multiple strategic. They used religion. For example, we have Akbar the Great, who came up with Deen-e-Ilahi. He also used marital alliances. In fact, marital alliances has been the constant theme. Here also, Chandragupta Maurya got married to Seleucus Nicator's daughter. Who was Seleucus Nicator? Seleucus Nicator was one of the army generals of Alexander the Great, who was left to govern the Indian borders. So Seleucus Nicator got married. Seleucus Nicator got his daughter married to Chandragupta Maurya, the Indian Chakravarti. So the idea of marital alliances is also strategic. The religion has been used by Ashoka, marital alliances. And during the modern times and recent times, we have seen the evolution of India's foreign policy in the colonial era, and also we have seen non-aligned movement, which has been used not exactly as non-aligned, but strategical alignment was the real name of the game, called non-aligned movement. Clever calf drinking milk from two cows. So here you can talk about the colonial masters. The Marathas were able to come up with some kind of a statecraft, and they declared Swaraj of their own conception. But because of the infight between the Mughals and the Marathas, the third power, the external power, that is the Britishers, were able to gain hold. And divide and rule policy, bait and bleed policy of the company worked, and Mughals declined, Marathas declined, and there was ascendancy of the British Empire over India because of not understanding the importance of strategic culture, not remaining united, not keeping the national interest first. And of recent examples, we can cite multiple examples from the evolution of India's foreign policy. So these are some of the key ideas where you can talk about the chronology, where the strategic culture was waxing and waning. During the waxing phase, that is the growth phase of strategic culture, India kept on growing, kept on accumulating power, the culture kept on flourishing, but during the waning phase, for example post Gupta period, lack of a strategic culture is leaving India in a dark state of affair. So you can cite multiple examples. This is just one guideline with the help of which you can come up with a decent answer. You can submit the answer to me on my email ID, and if needed we will review the answers, and that will be all for today from my side. We will come up with a specific videos on some of the important topics after a while, and you can keep your doubts in the comment section. You can type it or you can send it to me. I will try to reply all of them. Thank you. Thanks a lot.